All right, let's go. Number 10. Metallurgy and the End of the Stone Age. Approximately 7,000 years ago, somewhere in the mineral-rich hills of the Balkans, a human being held a piece of greenish stone over a fire and discovered that the rock itself could bleed. The stone was malachite, a copper ore. Under sustained heat, it released droplets of pure metal, which cooled into something the world had never seen.
Not chipped.
Not flaked, not shaped by fracture, poured. The Stone Age had been the only age. For roughly 3.3 million years, every cutting edge, every weapon, every blade that had ever touched human flesh or animal hide had been made by striking one rock against another. Then someone made a blade by melting the earth. The earliest copper smelting sites have been confirmed in the Balkans and across the Middle East, with slag heaps and furnace remains dating to approximately 5000 BC. The transition was not immediate. For nearly 2,000 years, copper remained a luxury material. Soft, beautiful, easily bent, useful for ornaments and ceremonial blades, but inadequate for serious work. A copper axe would deform against a hardwood trunk. A copper sword would bend in combat. The metal had unlocked a new category of matter, but it had not yet unlocked a new category of civilization. Then around 3300 BC, somewhere in the trading corridors between Mesopotamia and the highlands of Anatolia, someone added tin. The resulting alloy was bronze, and bronze changed everything. It was harder than copper. It held an edge. It could be cast into shapes impossible for stone. It could be hammered, melted down, and recast into something else entirely. A bronze sword that broke could become a bronze plow. A bronze plow that wore down could become a bronze arrowhead. The material was no longer fixed. It was fluid across time, reshapeable across generations, an inheritance that could be remade into whatever the next generation required. Stone could not do this. Stone, once broken, was broken forever. Bronze remembered nothing of its previous form. The implications are staggering. The discovery did not just require fire. It required the systematic application of chemistry by people who had no concept of chemistry. It required the construction of furnaces capable of sustaining temperatures above 1,000 degrees Celsius. It required an understanding of ore identification, of reduction, of crucible engineering, of mold making, of cooling rates. It required a population that could afford to support specialists who did nothing but stare into fires and take notes that were not yet writing. But here's where the standard narrative of human progress falls apart. Bronze requires copper and tin, and copper and tin almost never occur in the same place on Earth. The copper deposits of Cyprus are nowhere near the tin deposits of Cornwall. The copper of the Sinai is nowhere near the tin of Afghanistan. To make bronze, prehistoric humans had to know that two specific substances existed in two distant geographies, had to value those substances enough to organize their acquisition, and had to construct trade networks capable of moving heavy raw materials across thousands of kilometers of unmapped terrain. The Bronze Age was not a local achievement. It was a planetary achievement. It required a world already stitched together by roots, relationships, and shared knowledge that no surviving record describes. Cornish tin reached the eastern Mediterranean. Afghan tin reached Mesopotamia. Carpathian copper reached the Aegean. Donkey caravans, river barges, and coastal vessels moved tons of metal across landscapes inhabited by people who spoke languages no living person can reconstruct. The Bronze Age was the first time in human history that civilization itself became dependent on a global supply chain. And it was so transformative that we no longer name eras by the people who lived in them. We name them by the metal they carried: the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. Entire centuries of human existence reduced to the alloy in the blade. No king, no empire, no religion has ever received that honor, only the metal. What makes metallurgy particularly haunting is its silence. We know the furnaces existed. We have the slag, the ingots, the tools, the weapons recovered from graves and shipwrecks across 3 continents. We do not know who first added tin to copper, or why, or whether the discovery happened once and spread, or many times in many places. The first metallurgist is gone. What they left behind is every blade that followed. Number 9. Writing systems and the moment prehistory ended. In 1929, German archaeologist Julius Jordan excavated a series of clay tablets from the ruins of Uruk in southern Iraq. The tablets were small, palm-sized, unremarkable to look at. Their surfaces were covered in wedge-shaped impressions, arranged in tidy rows. The marks were not decoration. They were not art. They were language fossilized in baked earth, approximately 5,500 years old. What Jordan had uncovered was the moment a species began speaking to its own future. The earliest proto-writing emerged in Mesopotamia roughly 5,500 years ago, in the Sumerian city-states that clustered along the Tigris and Euphrates. The system is called cuneiform, and it began as something almost mundane. Accountants needed to track grain, temple administrators needed to record offerings, merchants needed to remember debts. The first writers were not poets, they were bureaucrats. They pressed the cut end of a reed stylus into wet clay, and the wedge-shaped marks they left behind would outlast every kingdom that produced them. Approximately the same period, 4,000 kilometers to the southwest, something nearly identical was happening on the banks of the Nile. Egyptian hieroglyphs emerged in parallel with cuneiform, the two systems developing within centuries of each other across landscapes separated by deserts that humans of that era could barely cross. The Egyptians chose a different path. Pictographic symbols carved into stone, painted onto papyrus, layered with phonetic and ideographic meaning in ways modern linguists are still untangling. Two civilizations, two scripts, two solutions to the same problem, appearing at almost the same geological instant. The numbers compound. Writing was invented independently at least 4 separate times in human history. Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, Mesoamerica. 4 distinct civilizations, separated by oceans and continents, with no contact between them, arrived at the same fundamental idea. Marks on a surface can preserve speech across time. The probability that 4 unrelated populations would converge on this concept by accident strains conventional explanation. Something about the human mind, once it reaches a certain density of social complexity, appears to demand a way to fix language in matter. But here's where the story becomes genuinely impossible. The Jiahu symbols. Carved into tortoise shells and bone artifacts, excavated from a Neolithic site in central China's Henan province, date back approximately 8,600 years. 3,000 years before Sumerian cuneiform. 3,000 years before Egyptian hieroglyphs. The marks resemble characters that would appear in mature Chinese writing systems millennia later, including symbols interpreted by some researchers as early forms of I and sun. Whether the Jihu symbols constitute true writing or a precursor system remains debated in journals from Beijing to Cambridge. What remains undisputed is the carving itself. Someone at Jiahu, 3,000 years before any other known writing system, was already making marks intended to mean something. The implications are staggering. Every civilization that has ever existed, every philosophy, every law code, every religious text, every scientific treatise, every love letter, every history of every war exists because someone, somewhere, decided that sound could be made visible. Before writing, knowledge died with the people who held it. A medicine that worked, a route that led to water, a name of an ancestor 4 generations removed, all of it depended on memory and recitation. One bad winter, one collapsed community, one generation that failed to transmit, and entire libraries of human understanding vanished without record. Writing broke that fragility. For the first time in the history of our species, a person could speak to someone who would not be born for 1,000 years. What makes writing particularly unsettling as an invention is what it formally erased. The boundary between prehistory and history is not drawn at a war, or a city, or a king. It is drawn at the first legible mark. Everything before writing is prehistoric by definition, regardless of how complex the societies were that lived there. The cave painters of Lascaux, the megalith builders of Göbekli Tepe, the engineers who raised the first cities of the Indus Valley, all of them are filed under prehistory because none of them left words we can read. Their thoughts are gone. Their names are gone. The boundary is absolute and unforgiving. On one side, silence. On the other, voices that still speak. The tablets Jordan recovered at Uruk are still legible. The reeds that pressed them rotted within a season. The hands that held the reeds turned to dust before the first pyramid was built. The marks remain. Number 8. The bow and arrow. In 2010, archaeologist Lynn Wadley and a team from the University of the Witwatersrand published findings from a rock shelter in the cliffs above the Tongati River in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. The site was Sibutu Cave. Embedded in sediment layers dating to approximately 64,000 years ago, they recovered something that rewrote the timeline of human engineering. Small, carefully shaped stone points, bearing microscopic traces of impact damage and adhesive residue. Wear patterns consistent with high-velocity penetration. Geometry too small to function as a hand-thrown spear point. These were arrowheads. Not the precursors of arrowheads. Not ambiguous flakes that might have served as projectile tips. Arrowheads, the kind that require a bow to launch them. The kind that demand a multi-component weapon system to function at all. The evidence pushed the origin of archery back tens of thousands of years beyond previous estimates, into a period when anatomically modern humans were still confined largely to Africa, surrounded by predators that outweighed them, outran them, and outclawed them in every direct encounter. What makes this discovery extraordinary isn't the antiquity alone. It's what the bow requires. A functioning bow is not a single object, it is a system. The stave must be cut from wood with the correct elasticity, seasoned to retain spring without splintering. The string must be twisted from animal sinew or plant fiber, tensioned precisely enough to store kinetic energy without snapping at full draw. The arrow shaft must be straight, balanced, and matched in weight to the bow's draw force. The point must be hafted to the shaft with adhesive strong enough to survive impact. The fletching, feather split, and bound at the rear of the shaft must be aligned to stabilize the projectile in flight through aerodynamic rotation. Wood sinew, stone or bone, feathers, adhesive. 5 distinct material categories, each requiring its own processing knowledge, integrated into a single functional weapon. The cognitive demands are staggering. To build a bow, a human must hold the finished system in mind while gathering components that look nothing like the final tool. They must understand cause and effect across days or weeks of preparation. They must teach this process to the next generation in a form that survives without writing, without diagrams, without anything but demonstration and memory. The bow is not an invention, it is a curriculum, and it changed everything. Before the bow, hunting meant proximity. A human pursuing prey with a spear or a club had to close the distance to within a few meters of an animal that could kick, gore, trample, or bite. Every successful hunt was a survived encounter. Every failed hunt could end in death or injury that would later end in death. The bow severed that equation. A hunter at 20 or 30 meters could strike an animal that had no awareness of being targeted. Risk dropped, yield rose, caloric returns climbed. Populations that had clung to the edges of ecosystems began to occupy them as apex predators with no natural rival. But here's where the implications extend further than hunting. The bow transformed warfare. Every human conflict for the next 60,000 years would be shaped by it. The composite bows of the Eurasian steppes, the longbows of medieval England, the recurved bows of the Mongol cavalry that conquered the largest contiguous land empire in human history, the flat bows of indigenous North America, the bamboo bows of feudal Japan. Every continent humans colonized, the bow followed. Every culture that built armies, built archers. From the African savanna to the Arctic tundra, from Patagonia to Siberia, the same fundamental technology, wood under tension, string storing energy, projectile released at velocity, remained the dominant ranged weapon on Earth for over 600 centuries. Nothing else in human technological history holds that record. Not the wheel, not the plow, not the sword, only the bow. Its reign ended only when gunpowder weapons crossed the threshold of reliability sometime in the 17th century. And even then, the displacement was gradual. Armies retained archers for generations after firearms existed. The bow did not lose its utility. It lost its monopoly. What sits in Sabudu Cave is not a primitive tool. It is the earliest known evidence of a weapon system so refined that humanity would not improve upon its fundamental principle for 60,000 years. The people who built it understood elasticity, ballistics, aerodynamics, and adhesion chemistry without having a word for any of those concepts. They engineered a solution to the problem of distance, and they engineered it so completely that their descendants on every habitable continent would inherit the same answer. The stones are still there in the sediment of that South African shelter, still bearing the microscopic scars of the animals they brought down before the last ice age had ended. Number 7. Pottery and ceramics, the containers that came before the harvest. In 1962, archaeologists working in the limestone uplands of Jiangxi province in southeastern China began excavating a modest cave called Xianrendong. For decades, the site yielded the expected debris of late Pleistocene life. Stone tools, animal bones, charcoal lenses from ancient hearths. The cave was clearly old, clearly inhabited, clearly significant. But it took nearly half a century of refined dating techniques before the true magnitude of what Xianrendong contained became clear. In 2012, a team led by archaeologist Xiaohong Wu at Peking University published radiocarbon dates in Science that pushed the origins of an entire technology back by thousands of years. The pottery fragments recovered from the lowest occupation layers of Xianrendong Cave were approximately 20,000 years old. That number deserves a moment of consideration. 20,000 years ago, the last glacial maximum was strangling the northern hemisphere. Ice sheets 2 kilometers thick covered modern Canada and Scandinavia. Sea levels were 120 meters below today's. Agriculture would not be invented for another 8,000 years. The Fertile Crescent was a cold steppe. There were no villages, no fields, no granaries. No permanent settlements of any kind in the region that produced these vessels. And yet someone in that frozen world was shaping clay, drying it, and firing it hard enough to hold water, cook food, and survive 20 millennia in the ground. The fragments themselves are unassuming. Coarse, reddish-brown shards, walls a centimeter thick, surfaces still marked by the fingers that pressed them into shape. Some show scorch marks on their exteriors, evidence of direct contact with cooking fires. The vessels were used, not symbolic. Whoever made them was boiling, rendering, fermenting, processing. They were extracting calories from food sources that raw consumption could not unlock. Bones simmered for marrow and grease. Tough plant tubers softened into digestibility. Fish stewed down to nutrient-dense broths. Possibly even early experiments in fermentation, the chemistry that would eventually produce beer, wine, and preserved foods across every continent humans would touch. But here's where the standard model of human development collapses. For over a century, the conventional narrative was simple and clean. Humans settled down, started farming, then invented pottery to store their surplus grain. Settlement, then agriculture, then ceramics. A tidy progression from nomadism to civilization. Xianrendong demolished that sequence. Pottery predates agriculture by roughly 8,000 years. The hunter-gatherers who fired these vessels were not transitioning toward farming. They were not preparing for a sedentary future. They were mobile foragers in an Ice Age landscape. And they had figured out how to transform Earth into permanent fire-hardened containers thousands of years before anyone planted a seed on purpose. The implication reorders everything. Sophisticated technology does not require settlement. Settlement does not require agriculture. The neat developmental ladder taught in schools is a fiction imposed on a far stranger reality, one in which mobile bands of hunters were already practicing a chemistry that turned mud into stone. Subsequent discoveries have only deepened the picture. Pottery fragments dating between 14,000 and 17,000 years old have been recovered from sites in Japan, the Russian Far East, and across southern China. The Jomon culture of Japan produced ceramic vessels for over 10,000 years before transitioning to agriculture, an unbroken tradition of hunter-gatherer pottery that lasted longer than recorded history. The technology was not a single invention diffusing outward from one source. It was being discovered, reinvented, and refined across vast stretches of East Asia by populations who had no need for grain storage because they had no grain. What pottery left behind has become one of archaeology's most valuable inheritances. Potsherds, the broken fragments of fired clay, survive almost indefinitely in the soil. They carry the fingerprints of their makers, the residues of their contents, the stylistic choices that mark one community from another. Different cultures developed unique decorative grammars. Chord-marked surfaces, incised geometric patterns, painted bands, applied ridges. A trained archaeologist can often identify a site's cultural affiliation from a single fragment the size of a coin. Pottery became, and remains, the primary dating tool for vast stretches of prehistory. The people who made the Xianrendong vessels are gone. Their language, their names, their understanding of what they had achieved are unrecoverable. But they had crossed a threshold that placed them, technologically, closer to us than to the toolmakers who came before. They had learned to remake the earth itself. And the next threshold they would cross was not made of stone or clay, but of pigment and shadow on the walls of caves. Number 6. Cave paintings and the dawn of symbolic thought. In 2014, Archaeologist Maxime Aubert at Griffith University in Western Australia traveled to a remote limestone cave on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi to test pigment samples from a series of hand stencils and animal figures that had been known to local researchers for decades, but largely dismissed by the wider scientific community. The accepted wisdom held that the great flowering of human art had occurred in Europe, in the painted caverns of France and Spain, somewhere around 30,000 to 35,000 years ago. Sulawesi's art was assumed to be far younger, the product of recent migrations across the Pacific. Ober's uranium series dating returned a result that demolished the assumption. The mineral crusts that had grown over the paintings were at least 45,500 years old. The art beneath them was older still. The painting that produced the date was not a crude smudge or an abstract mark. It was a life-size depiction of a Sulawesi warty pig, rendered in deep red ochre, with a clear dorsal crest, facial features, and the suggestion of movement across the cave wall. It was art in the fullest sense of the word, and it had been made by human hands more than 45 millennia before the first stone of the first city was laid. The implications detonated outward from that single date. If sophisticated figurative art existed in Indonesia 45,500 years ago, then the cognitive capacity to produce it had to have been present in the human populations that migrated out of Africa tens of thousands of years earlier. The painters of Sulawesi were not pioneers. They were inheritors of a tradition whose origins remain unknown. The geographic spread of the evidence is staggering. In southwestern France, the cave of Lascaux contains nearly 600 painted animals across its chambers. Bulls and horses, and stags rendered with such anatomical precision that veterinarians have identified the specific breeds depicted. In northern Spain, the ceiling of Altamira blooms with bison painted in red, black, and violet, their bodies contoured along the natural bulges of the rock so that the stone itself provides the musculature. In the Ardèche Valley of southeastern France, the cave of Chauvet preserves images of lions, rhinoceroses, and mammoths that radiocarbon dating places at over 30,000 years old. Across Africa, Australia, and South America, hand stencils appear on cave walls in compositions so similar that an observer could mistake one continent's work for another's. The same gesture, the same pigment, the same impulse. The materials these artists used were not improvised. They were engineered. Red and yellow ochres were mined from specific iron-rich deposits, sometimes transported across distances of more than 100 kilometers. Charcoal was selected for particular woods that produced particular tones. Manganese dioxide was ground to a powder for the deepest blacks. Animal fat was rendered as a binder, allowing the pigments to adhere to damp limestone and survive for tens of thousands of years in the dark. The paintings were applied with brushes made from chewed twigs and frayed bone, with fingertips, and in the case of the hand stencils, by spraying pigment from the mouth around, a hand pressed flat against the wall. The technique required planning, preparation, and a transmitted body of knowledge passed from one generation of artists to the next. But here is where the discovery becomes genuinely impossible to reconcile with the standard narrative of human cognitive development. The painters of Chauvet, working by the flickering light of tallow lamps more than 30,000 years ago, used techniques that European art would forget for the next 300 centuries. They employed perspective, foreshortening the bodies of charging animals so that the viewer perceives depth and motion. They used shading, blending pigments along the contours of muscle and bone to suggest three-dimensional volume. They depicted sequences of movement, painting the same animal multiple times in slightly altered positions so that the figure appears to gallop across the wall when viewed by a moving light source. These were not the techniques of a primitive mind groping toward representation. These were the techniques of mature, confident artists working within an established visual language. And then they vanished. The perspective, the shading, the kinetic composition. All of it disappears from the human record and does not return until the workshops of Florence and Bruges in the 15th century. 40,000 years of artista silence separate the painters of Chauvet from the painters of the Renaissance. The cognitive machinery was there. The training was there. The hands were the same hands. But something was lost, and it stayed lost for longer than recorded history has existed. What the cave paintings represent is the first physical evidence of the human mind doing the thing that makes it human. Not tool making, which our ancestors had been doing for millions of years before the genus Homo even existed. Not fire, which is a chemical process we learn to control. Symbolic thought. The capacity to take a thing and stand it in for another thing. To take pigment and stone and render an animal that is not present. To tell a story. To imagine an absence and fill it with meaning. Every cathedral, every novel, every equation, every god, every nation, every piece of music ever composed descends from the cognitive act performed in the dark of Sulawesi 45,500 years ago when a human being looked at a wall and decided that it could become something else. The painters are gone. Their names, their languages, their reasons for descending hundreds of meters into lightless caverns to paint animals they would never show to the daylight, all of it is lost. What remains is the pigment, still adhering to the stone, still legible, still waiting in the dark for the next torch to find it. Number 5. The domestication of the dog, the partnership older than civilization itself. In 1914, workers excavating a quarry near Bonn, Germany, uncovered a grave that shouldn't have made sense. Buried alongside 2 human skeletons was the jawbone of an animal that resembled a wolf, but wasn't quite. The bone was too small. The teeth were crowded in a way no wolf's would be. The grave dated to approximately 14,000 years ago, deep in the Paleolithic, thousands of years before the first farmer planted the first seed. Whatever this animal was, the people buried with it had considered it worth interring beside their own dead. The Bonn Oberkassel dog, as it came to be known, is one of the earliest undisputed pieces of evidence for an extraordinary fact. Long before humans had learned to grow food, build cities, or write a single word, they had a companion. Dogs were the first, not goats, not sheep, not cattle, not wheat or barley or rice. Before any other living thing on Earth had been transformed by human hands, the wolf had become something else. Genetic studies conducted across multiple laboratories over the past 2 decades, analyzing mitochondrial DNA from ancient canid remains found in Siberia, Belgium, Germany, and the Czech Republic, have converged on a conclusion that pushes the relationship deeper into prehistory than anyone had imagined. The earliest divergence between dogs and their wolf ancestors may have begun as long as 40,000 years ago. The latest estimates place the partnership at no less than 15,000 years old. Either figure is staggering. Either figure means that the bond between humans and dogs predates settled agriculture by tens of thousands of years. The wolves that became dogs are gone. This is the part of the story that genetic research has revealed most clearly and most strangely. Modern gray wolves are not the ancestors of modern dogs. They are cousins. The actual population that crossed the threshold into domestication, a now extinct lineage of Pleistocene wolves, disappeared from the earth, leaving behind only the transformed descendants that had chosen, or been chosen by, a different path. The ancestral wolf does not exist anymore. Its only surviving genetic legacy walks beside humans, sleeps at their feet, and has done so for longer than any city has stood. The mechanism of the domestication remains debated, but the most compelling models describe a process that was mutual, not imposed. Hunter-gatherer encampments produced waste. Bones, scraps, the discarded ends of butchered animals. Wolves on the edges of human territory began to scavenge. The boldest individuals, the ones whose flight distance was shorter, who tolerated proximity to fire and noise, and the strange upright creatures who controlled both, ate better and bred more successfully. Over generations, perhaps thousands of generations, a population of wolves emerged that no longer fled. They lingered, they watched, they followed. And the humans, who had been hunting with weapons, fire, and increasingly sophisticated minds, began to recognize the utility of an animal that could track game over distances no human nose could manage, that could detect approaching predators in the dark, that could pin a wounded deer until the spears arrived, that could press its warm body against a child during a winter night when the fire burned low. The exchange was real. The wolves received food, shelter, and protection from the harsher pressures of wild existence. The humans received hunting partners, sentinels, and a source of warmth that no other animal would provide for tens of thousands of years. Neither species forced the arrangement. It emerged, and once it had emerged, it never broke. What makes this particular discovery so unsettling is the timeline it forces upon us. Consider what humans did not yet have when the first dogs began sleeping near their fires. They did not have agriculture. They did not have permanent settlements. They did not have pottery in most regions. They did not have the wheel. They did not have writing. They did not have metal. They did not have any of the things we associate with civilization, with progress, with the foundations of the modern world. They had stone tools, fire, language, and a dog. That was the inventory. The relationship that millions of households today take for granted. The dog sleeping on the couch, the dog waiting at the door, the dog watching its human with an attention no other species offers, was already ancient before any farmer planted any field. The implication extends further. Every other domesticated species, the cattle that built agricultural empires, the horses that carried armies across continents, the chickens that feed the modern world, all of them came later. The dog came first because the dog was not a resource. It was a partner. The bond that civilization would eventually build itself upon, the willingness of one species to live alongside another, to trust it, to work with it, to bury it with honor, was forged in the firelight of the Paleolithic by people whose names will never be known and whose languages have left no trace. The dogs they raised are gone. The wolves those dogs descended from are extinct. But the partnership itself, the oldest interspecies alliance in the human story, continues every time a dog turns its head at the sound of its name. Number 4. The wheel. The invention so obvious it took humanity hundreds of thousands of years to figure out. In 2002, a team of Slovenian archaeologists excavating a peat bog in the marshlands south of Ljubljana recovered an object that would rewrite the timeline of one of humanity's most celebrated inventions. Buried beneath layers of waterlogged sediment that had preserved it for over 5 millennia, lay a solid disc of ash wood, roughly 28 inches in diameter, dark brown with age, and still bearing the unmistakable signature of human craftsmanship. Radiocarbon dating placed its construction at approximately 5,150 years ago. The Ljubljana Marshes wheel, as it came to be known, is the oldest wooden wheel ever discovered, and its existence raises a question that should disturb anyone who assumes human progress is inevitable. Why did it take so long? Consider the timeline. Anatomically modern humans had existed for roughly 300,000 years before this wheel was carved. Our ancestors had crossed oceans, painted caves, domesticated wolves, and shaped stone tools for over 3 million years. They had mastered fire. They had built ranged weapons of extraordinary engineering complexity. And yet the wheel, the symbol of human ingenuity in every modern textbook, emerged only at the tail end of human prehistory. The civilization that produced the Ljubljana wheel had already been farming for thousands of years. They had already begun smelting copper. They had already developed writing in other parts of the world. The wheel was not the first great human invention. It was one of the last. But here's where the standard narrative collapses entirely. The wheel was not invented for transportation. The earliest applications of rotational motion in human technology were not carts, not chariots, not vehicles of any kind. They were potter's wheels. Spinning platforms used by craftsmen in Mesopotamia and southeastern Europe to shape clay vessels with a precision that hand building could never achieve. The wheel began its existence as a tool for art and storage, not movement. Generations of potters spun clay on rotating discs without anyone making the conceptual leap that the same principle could carry weight across distance. The disc existed, the motion existed. The application that would reshape human civilization remained invisible. The true innovation, the one that mattered, was not the wheel itself. It was the wheel and axle. A rotating disc is useless without a fixed central shaft that allows it to spin freely while bearing a load. The engineering required to fit a wheel to an axle, to reduce friction enough that the system could move under weight, to ensure the wheel did not bind or split, demanded a level of precision that prehistoric craftsmen had to develop from scratch. The Ljubljana wheel itself shows evidence of a square hole at its center, designed to accept an axle that would have rotated with the wheel as a single unit. This was not a casual modification of pottery technology. This was a fundamentally new machine. Once the wheel and axle combination existed, the consequences cascaded across every dimension of human life. Trade networks that had been constrained by the carrying capacity of human backs and pack animals suddenly expanded by orders of magnitude. Construction projects that would have been impossible became routine. Within 1,000 years of the Ljubljana wheel, war chariots were thundering across the battlefields of the Bronze Age, transforming the nature of organized violence. Empires would rise and fall on the strength of their wheeled armies. The shape of cities, the roots of commerce, the geography of political power, all of it bent around an invention that had begun as a tool for shaping cups. And yet, the most disturbing aspect of the wheel's history is what it reveals about the assumption of inevitability. If the wheel were truly an obvious invention, the natural endpoint of human problem solving, it should have appeared everywhere. It did not. The Inca Empire, one of the most sophisticated civilizations the Americas ever produced, built mountain roads stretching over 25,000 miles, engineered suspension bridges, managed populations in the millions, and constructed cities of stone so precise that modern engineers still cannot replicate their joinery. They never used the wheel for transportation. They had wheels. Children's toys recovered from Mesoamerican archaeological sites show small wheeled figurines. The principle was known. The application was rejected, ignored, or judged irrelevant to the terrain and the labor systems they had built. Across the Andes, goods moved on the backs of llamas and human porters for centuries, while the rest of the world rolled forward on axles. The implications are staggering. Human progress is not a single road with a single destination. It is a branching network of possibilities, and the inventions we consider foundational are not foundations at all. They are choices, accidents, convergences of need and material and imagination that could just as easily have never occurred. The Ljubljana wheel sits today in a Slovenian museum, a dark disk of ash wood resting under climate-controlled glass, and the silence around it carries a question that civilization rarely permits itself to ask. How many other inventions, equally transformative, equally obvious in retrospect, are still waiting in the wood and stone of a world that has not yet thought to look for them? Number 3, agriculture and the invention of the future. In the hills of what is now southeastern Turkey, northern Syria, and the river valleys of Iraq, approximately 12,000 years ago, something happened that has no precedent in the previous 2.5 million years of human existence. People stopped moving. Not all of them, not all at once. But across a crescent of land curving from the Mediterranean coast through the foothills of the Zagros Mountains to the Persian Gulf, communities that had spent their entire evolutionary history as nomadic hunter-gatherers began to do something their ancestors had never done. They planted seeds in the ground and waited. The crops they chose were unremarkable to look at. Wild einkorn wheat, a grass that grew in scattered stands across the Fertile Crescent, its slender stalks topped with brittle seed heads that shattered at the slightest touch. Barley, lentils, peas, plants that had existed for millions of years without human interference. What changed wasn't the plants. It was the relationship between the plants and the people who ate them. Hunter-gatherers had harvested wild grain for tens of thousands of years before this moment. But somewhere in the hills above the Euphrates, someone took the seeds from the harvest and pressed them back into the soil. Then they stayed long enough to see what came up. The consequences cascaded outward in ways no one alive at the time could have anticipated. Permanent settlements appeared where temporary camps had stood. Storage pits filled with grain meant food existed independent of the hunt. Populations that had been constrained for hundreds of thousands of years by the carrying capacity of wild landscapes began to expand. Villages became towns, towns became cities. The first true urban centers, Jericho, Çatalhöyük, Uruk, emerged from soil that had been planted, harvested, and replanted for generations. The trajectory from a handful of einkorn seeds to the city, the empire, the nation-state runs in an unbroken line through the dirt of the Fertile Crescent. But here's where the standard narrative of agricultural progress becomes genuinely disturbing. The shift to farming did not make individual humans healthier. Skeletal evidence from early agricultural sites across the Near East shows shorter stature, weaker bones, dental decay, and signs of chronic malnutrition compared to the hunter-gatherer populations that preceded them. The diet narrowed, the labor intensified. Diseases that had never existed in human populations emerged from the close quarters of village life and the proximity to domesticated animals. Smallpox, measles, influenza. Most of the great killers of human history are gifts from the agricultural revolution, pathogens that required dense, settled populations to survive. The farmer lived a harder, sicker, shorter life than the forager whose territory he replaced. And then there was the new architecture of human society itself. When food could be stored, food could be owned. When land could be planted, land could be claimed. Property, The concept of permanent, defensible, inheritable possession of a piece of the earth did not exist in any meaningful sense before agriculture. With it came hierarchy. Those who controlled the granaries controlled the village. Those who controlled the villages controlled the region. The flat social structures of nomadic bands, where leadership was situational and resources were shared by necessity, gave way to the first kings, the first priesthoods, the first slaves. Inequality is not a deviation from the human story. It is a direct inheritance from the moment we decided to stay in one place. The truly unsettling aspect is what the archaeological record reveals about the geography of this transformation. Agriculture did not emerge once, in one place, and spread outward. It emerged independently in at least 7 different regions across the planet, separated by oceans, continents, and tens of thousands of kilometers. In the Fertile Crescent, wheat and barley. In northern China, along the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, millet and rice. In the highlands of New Guinea, taro and bananas. In Mesoamerica, maize, beans, and squash. In the Andes, potatoes and quinoa. In sub-Saharan Africa, sorghum and yams. In eastern North America, sunflower and goosefoot. 7 separate populations of human beings, with no contact with each other, no shared language, no common cultural framework, arrived at the same revolutionary idea within a window of a few thousand years. This is not a coincidence that scientists have fully explained. The end of the last ice age created climatic conditions across multiple continents that made certain plants more abundant and certain regions more habitable. But the leap from harvesting wild plants to deliberately cultivating them required a cognitive and social transformation that has no obvious environmental trigger. Something shifted in the human species during this narrow geological window. Populations that had never met one another, working with completely different plants in completely different ecosystems, all crossed the same invisible threshold. The implications are staggering. Either agriculture is an inevitable destination that any sufficiently developed human culture will eventually reach, or something about the conditions of that specific period in Earth's history pushed our species across a boundary it had never crossed in 2 million years of existence. We do not know which. What we do know is that the wild einkorn wheat that grew in the hills above the Euphrates still grows there today. It still shatters at a touch. It still scatters its seeds the way it has for millions of years. The plant has not changed. We did. And every city on Earth, every road, every empire, every line of inherited wealth, and every disease that travels through dense populations exists because someone somewhere in those hills took a handful of seeds and pressed them back into the ground. Number 2, stone tools and the hands that existed before us. In 2011, a team of archaeologists led by Sonia Harmond of Stony Brook University was searching for a contested fossil site near Lake Turkana in northern Kenya when they took a wrong turn. The dry hills shimmered. The landscape gave nothing away. By the time they realized their mistake, they were standing in a place called Lomekwi, a remote ridge of sun-bleached sediment that no one had any particular reason to investigate. They decided to look anyway. What they found rewrote the timeline of human ingenuity by 700,000 years. Embedded in the rock were 149 stone artifacts, cores from which flakes had been struck, hammerstones bearing the unmistakable scars of repeated impact. Sharp-edged fragments arranged in patterns that no geological process could produce. The team dated the deposits using paleomagnetic analysis and argon isotope ratios in the surrounding ash layers. The results were staggering. The tools were 3.3 million years old. That number is not a typo. It is older than our genus. It is older than the first member of Homo by at least 500,000 years. Whoever or whatever made these tools was not human. It was not even close to human in the way we understand the word. And yet it sat at Lomekwi, somewhere in the deep past, deliberately striking stone against stone to produce a working edge. The implications dismantled a century of assumptions. For generations, the prevailing theory had been clean and reassuring. Tools made us. The act of knapping a stone was supposed to be the spark that lit the cognitive fire of our lineage, the threshold our ancestors crossed to become Homo, to become us. Lomekwi pulled that threshold out from under the entire field. The tools came first. The hands that made them belong to creatures we cannot name with certainty. Possibly Kenyanthropus platyops, possibly an early Australopithecine, possibly something whose bones we have not yet found. Whatever they were, They had already crossed the line we had reserved for ourselves. Then, 2.6 million years ago, the work became refined. At Gona in Ethiopia and Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, the Oldowan industry emerged. These were not random fragments, they were a system. Choppers with worked edges for heavy cutting, scrapers for hide and tendon. Flakes so sharp that modern experimental archaeologists have used replicas to butcher entire carcasses in under an hour. The raw materials were chosen with care, basalt for its density, quartz for its fracture pattern. The makers understood, on some level beneath language, how stone wanted to break. The numbers around what these tools unlocked are difficult to absorb. A single Oldowan flake could open the hide of an antelope in seconds, a task that would otherwise require hours of tearing with teeth and fingers. A chopper could crack a femur and release the marrow inside, a fat-rich nutrient source that no other primate on the African savanna could access. Plants that were inedible raw became processable. Roots could be pounded. Tubers could be split. Entire categories of calories that had been locked away from our ancestors for millions of years suddenly opened. The diet expanded. The brain followed. But here's where the discovery becomes genuinely disturbing. The tools at Lomekwi are not crude experiments. They show intention. They show planning. They show an understanding of angle and force that, in any other context, we would call cognition. And they were made by hands that had not yet finished becoming hands. Anatomical studies of Australopithecine fossils show fingers still adapted for climbing, thumbs not yet fully opposable, wrists that lacked the locking mechanism modern humans rely on for a powerful grip. The tool makers of 3.3 million years ago were not equipped for the work they were doing. They were doing it anyway, and the work changed them. Over the millions of years that followed, the hands that knapped stone were reshaped by the stone itself. The thumb lengthened. The palm broadened. The fingertips developed denser nerve endings and finer motor control. The brain regions devoted to manual dexterity expanded, and as they expanded, they pulled adjacent regions with them, regions that would eventually handle language, sequence, and abstraction. The tool did not emerge from the human hand. The human hand emerged from the tool. The truly unsettling aspect is what this reveals about agency. We have always imagined ourselves as the inventors, the designers, the species that bent the world to its will. Lomekwi suggests the opposite. Something was knapping stone before there was a we. The pressure of that act, repeated across hundreds of thousands of generations, slowly carved the anatomy and the neurology that would eventually become Homo sapiens. The chisel made the sculptor. The hammer made the arm that swung it. There are 149 artifacts in the Lomekwi assemblage. There are likely millions more scattered across East Africa, buried beneath sediment, eroded into dust, washed into riverbeds, sitting in plain sight on hillsides that no archaeologist has yet walked. Each one was struck by a hand that no longer exists, belonging to a creature whose face we cannot reconstruct, whose voice we cannot imagine, whose mind we can only approach through the negative space of the work it left behind. They were not us. They made us possible. The stones are still there. They sit in collection drawers at the Turkana Basin Institute, cataloged and numbered, their edges still sharp after 3.25 million years. They are, by a wide margin, the oldest deliberate objects on Earth. And they were made by hands that had no name for what they were doing. Number 1, control of fire, the technology that rewrote what it meant to be alive. In a limestone cavern in the Kuruman Hills of South Africa, archaeologists from the University of Toronto and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem found something that pushed the story of humanity 1 million years into the dark. The site is called Wonderwork Cave, and in 2012, the team led by Francesco Berna published evidence in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that something inside that cave had been burning under deliberate human supervision 1 million years ago. Burned bone, ashed plant material, sediments heated to temperatures only sustained combustion can produce. And the burning was happening 30 meters inside the cave, far beyond the reach of any wildfire or lightning strike. Someone, or something not yet quite someone, was keeping a flame alive in the dark. The hominin most often credited with this achievement is Homo erectus, a species that walked the earth for nearly 2 million years and colonized terrain no primate had ever survived. Erectus reached the cold valleys of the Caucasus. Erectus crossed into the high latitudes of northern China. Erectus stood at the edges of ecosystems that should have killed any tropical ape and walked into them anyway. The reason they could is sitting in the ash layer at Wonderwork. Fire was not an accessory. Fire was the prerequisite. The implications run deeper than warmth and predator defense, though both mattered. In 2009, primatologist Richard Wrangham at Harvard published the cooking hypothesis, arguing that the controlled application of heat to food was the single most consequential event in the evolution of the human body. Cooking breaks down cellulose and denatures proteins. It unlocks calories that raw food simply cannot deliver. It shortens digestion. It reduces the gut. And the metabolic energy freed by that smaller gut, Wrangham argued, was redirected upward into the most expensive organ any animal has ever grown, the brain. Our skulls expanded because something in our lineage learned to put meat in a fire. The numbers behind this are difficult to absorb. The human brain consumes roughly 20% of our resting metabolic energy, despite accounting for 2% of our body mass. No raw food diet on Earth can sustain that ratio in an animal our size. Every chimpanzee spends 6 hours a day chewing. Every human spends less than 1. The difference, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of years, is a species. Cooking did not merely feed us. Cooking sculpted us. But here's where the story stops being about biology and starts being about everything else. Fire extended the productive day. When the sun fell, human activity did not. The hours after dusk, hours that every other primate spends silent and still, became hours of gathering, repairing, teaching, remembering. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner's work with the Juhansi of the Kalahari suggests that firelight conversation is qualitatively different from daylight talk. Daytime words are practical. Firelight words are stories, myths, lineages. The architecture of meaning itself may have been built in the soft orange light of a hearth 1,000,000 years ago. Fire reshaped social structure. People gathered around it. Hierarchies formed around who tended it, who fed it, who carried its embers when the band moved. Fire reshaped migration. Cold climates that had been lethal became habitable. Fire reshaped the night. The terror of darkness, the predator-dense black hours that had governed primate behavior for tens of millions of years, was pushed back to the edge of the light. Everything that follows in this list, every stone tool refined in the firelight, every clay pot hardened in a kiln, every bronze blade poured from a crucible, every grain cooked into bread, every word written by a scribe working past sunset, descends from a single technological achievement preserved in the ashes of a South African cave. Somewhere, 1,000,000 years ago, a creature that was not quite us crouched in the dark and decided not to let the flame go out. We do not know their name. We do not know what they thought as they fed the fire. We only know that they kept it alive, and that every fire since then, in every hearth, in every furnace, in every engine that has ever turned, is the same fire, passed hand to hand across 1,000,000 years of nights. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.